So I've also been asked to be the discussant for these three papers. I'm not an election studies person, so bear with me. Probably I've been selected because there were two papers on Austria and I happen to be an Austrian. But there is a risk that you talk from your intuitions and media consumption rather than from the in-depth knowledge about the data that have been presented here. But I'll try to also be fair to the three papers by having three questions for each of them, or three comments sometimes. So starting with Wolfgang's paper. The main story seemed to be that Kurz was successful in this election partly by stealing the FPÖ position. So this is the common wisdom that Wolfgang somehow tried to nuance but didn't completely debunk. The idea that I had when looking at this was that that seems to defeat a hypothesis that is widely held and that I also share, which is that centrist parties can never fully catch up with radical populist parties because the radical populist parties can always further escalate their rhetorics and their policy demands. So in Austria, this is known as the Schmid and Schmiedl hypothesis. Yeah? If you can vote for Schmid, why would you vote for Schmiedl? Meaning the centrist party stealing the issues from the radical ones. So why could it have been successful as a strategy this time around? And my idea would be that there was a combination of factors. One was the FPÖ, in my perception, did exercise some kind of self-restraint in the election campaign, and that might have been due to the effects of Brexit, the Trump election, and Van der Bellen's victory, where they realized that, for example, radical campaigning against the EU, toying with the idea of a referendum on EU exit would be just disastrous in the polls. So they toned down some of the rhetorics, and that may have made their own position a little bit less sharp than it could have been otherwise. And secondly, Kurz successfully posed as the new force in politics, although he had been a long time minister before in government. That was more related to his age rather than his political role. And by changing the party label, the party color, managed to attract the big right-wing potential of stranded voters out there that had previously voted for parties like the BZÖ and the Team Stronach that were out there on the market and were clearly easier to capture on the right-hand side of the spectrum rather than on any of the others. So that would be my story. And I think it roughly matches Wolfgang's data. The second brief question is, you talked about the immigration issue, which was clearly at the center stage, but I was wondering what happened to the other issues, for example, the EU issue that was very much at the center stage during the presidential election. How come that it was so, and I assume that it was less significant in the parliamentary elections? And why didn't parties that had an interest in talking about the EU foreground this as an issue of ownership where they could have been stronger than they were in the end? And the third question is just a puzzle about the green self-destruction that you have very well described. But it's still, in a way, difficult to figure out why a party would do this to itself, right? After having its biggest historic success with the election of their former chair to the federal presidency, falling out of parliament altogether. And one idea would be, also it doesn't show in your data, is that they didn't fully claim the issue ownership on immigration on the other side of the spectrum against the FPÖ in the way they had done before. They focused, in my perception, more on environmental issues and tried to deflect some of the critique that they were the well-meaning, naive, pro-immigrant party. And that might not have been good for them in order to fully mobilize their electoral potential. So that's all for Wolfgang. Then moving on to Manes. What's the effect of FPÖ participation in subnational government? I think the basic lesson here is it does make it harder to maintain the cordon sanitaire, to keep them out of federal parliament as a firm commitment of the same parties that are in subnational coalitions with them. And what you beautifully show, this is less true for the proportionality governments, where this is kind of a constitutional rule, they have to be in government, but it seems to be more true for inviting them into coalition governments. And I think the main turning point really was here the Burgenland elections, when the Social Democrats for the first time decided to form a coalition with the Freedom Party, and that led to a big discussion inside the SPÖ, where eventually they abandoned the cordon sanitaire principle and replaced it with a catalogue of criteria under which it would be possible to form coalitions with the FPÖ. And that, I think, does come from that subnational government coalition game to a certain extent, and explains why the SPÖ in the end probably had no other choice but to become softer on that issue. My second question or comment to you would be that to my perception, the FPÖ, especially in the parliament elections, tamed itself, as I said before, tamed some of its policies and rhetorics before rather than after gaining power. So the idea that they are tamed through exercise of power by having to be responsible is probably less true in these cases. It's probably more true that in order to gain power, they sometimes tame their own policies and rhetorics. But the FPÖ is extremely power hungry, and that might explain it. You know, their main grievance is that they had been shut out as the third camp in Austrian politics by the big parties, always not forming just a coalition, but dividing up the country and public posts and offices among themselves. And this is why, you know, unlike other radical right-wing parties, they were no longer committed to staying in opposition. They were really hungry in getting to get into power, and they tested it before at the subnational level in order to get into federal office in the end, and they succeeded. So the third point would be that the FPÖ, I think, has not been tamed through exercising power, but to a certain extent it was successfully contained in exercising power under the condition that it was the junior partner. And maybe we are going to see that again. But that story does not, cannot be generalized to a situation where they would be the strongest party in parliament and in government too. And you know, in the polls, for a long time, they were by far the strongest party altogether. So we have only one single story in Austria where they did exercise power fully. This was Carinthia under Jörg Haider, and it's now considered the biggest public administration disaster in Austria post-war history. For good reasons. So if you think about other cases where right-wing populist parties do manage to grasp power fully, like Viktor Orban and Kaczynski did, I think, again, you can see that prior to the election or in the election campaign, they tended to tone down some of their radicalism, but once they had power and they had it fully, they became actually more radical in power rather than becoming more responsible because there were no more they were not junior partners. They could fully play their game, and I think this is the danger that we still have to keep in mind. So finally, coming to Andre's paper, one of the features that comes out very strongly is this kind of post-communist ideological flexibility of parties in the party system. The PSD first campaigning for democracy reform, then dropping the topic when Băsescu is defeated. The PNL associated with austerity and now adopting pro-welfare policies. But I was just wondering whether, you know, this is still a story from a Western European perspective, where we tend to think, well, eventually these party systems are going to be ideologically consolidated. But if you look at Western Europe, we see also, you know, more instability in ideological terms in the party system. So maybe we should be thinking about convergence towards instability from different starting points in the post-communist countries and in Western Europe. Second observation, the main puzzle, the high share of mainstream party vote, especially for the PSD. I think it can be read in combination with two other striking findings: the extremely low turnout, especially in the parliamentary elections, and the strong majority saying that the country is heading in the wrong direction, apart from this brief Johannes effect in 2014, early 2015. So what that seems to indicate that there is a large potential of anti-establishment protest out there. It's just not mobilized in the elections. The USR, this party, you know, tries to mobilize a little bit on the progressive pro-European side, but 8.6 is probably not the full potential. There might be a much bigger potential out there on the right-hand side of the spectrum. that cannot be mobilized by these splintered radical right-wing parties. But if a new populist leader emerged, on the right end of the spectrum, there might be quite some potential that this person could actually tug into. And finally, my last comment, to stay within my 10 minutes, this striking distance between anti-corruption issues and nationalism, this axis in 2016. It occurred to me that you could have two explanations for this. One is that incumbents, especially the PSD, are more likely to be accused of corruption and also to actually be quite corrupt in that situation. So, and then they use nationalism as a deflection strategy, right? They emphasize nationalism in order not to have to respond to the charges of corruption. But the other possible explanation, and that's not an alternative one, might be that the fight against corruption in Romania, I imagine, is probably closely associated with EU. The EU puts it very high on the agenda. Romania has to be better on corruption issues. So if that's true, that would explain why there is this distance between nationalism and anti-corruption, because nationalism meaning anti-EU, you are on the other side. And if you say anti-corruption, you're really the pro-EU party in some extent. So that might be, there might be some association of this kind. So I'll stop it here and I'll open it for the Q&A.